Cedar Valley, Utah, September 15th, 1982. The smell of pine needles and morning frost hung in the thin mountain air as Sarah Mitchell laced up her hiking boots on the wooden porch of her family's cabin. At 23, she had the kind of restless energy that small mountain towns couldn't quite contain. Her auburn hair caught the early light filtering through the aspens, and she hummed a Fleetwood Mac tune while adjusting her blue daypack, the same one she'd carried through countless trails in the Wasatch Mountains. "You sure you don't want company today?" called her younger brother Danny from inside, his voice muffled by the screen door. The aroma of bacon and coffee drifted out, mixing with the crisp September air that promised winter wasn't far behind. "I need to think," Sarah replied, shouldering her pack with practiced ease. "Besides, you know how I am on the trails. I'll be back before Mom starts worrying." Cedar Valley in 1982 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where unlocked doors were the norm, and the biggest excitement usually came from high school football games or the annual Harvest Festival. The town of barely 800 souls nestled between towering peaks, connected to the outside world by a single winding highway that discouraged casual visitors. Sarah worked at Henderson's General Store, the heart of local gossip and community life. She'd been saving money to move to Salt Lake City, maybe even Los Angeles, dreams that seemed both impossibly distant and urgently necessary in a town where the biggest decision most people faced was whether to shop at Henderson's or drive 30 miles to the next town's grocery store. The trail she chose that morning was one she'd hiked dozens of times, a moderate climb through dense pine forest that opened onto a ridge overlooking the valley. Local miners had carved the path decades earlier, back when copper and silver drew hopeful men into these mountains. Now the old mines stood abandoned, their wooden supports weathered gray, and their entrances sealed with rusted warnings. Sarah's Honda Civic, a modest blue sedan that represented her independence, sat parked at the trailhead on Forest Service Road 47. She'd left a note on the dashboard, a habit her mother had insisted on since childhood, indicating her planned route and expected return time. Ridge Trail, back by 4 p.m. The morning passed peacefully. A local rancher, Walt Thompson, spotted her around 10 a.m. near Miller's Creek, about 2 miles up the trail. She waved and called out a cheerful greeting, her voice echoing off the granite walls of a narrow canyon. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Mitchell. When evening shadows began creeping across the valley floor and Sarah's car remained alone at the trailhead, her absence shifted from unusual to worrying. Mountain weather could change quickly in September, and even experienced hikers could find themselves in trouble as afternoon thunderstorms rolled in without warning. Her parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, drove to the trailhead at sunset. They found her car exactly where she'd left it, windows slightly fogged from the day's temperature changes, her note still visible on the dashboard. The surrounding forest held only the sounds of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. By 9 that night, when flashlight beams began cutting through the darkness and voices started calling Sarah's name across the mountainside, Cedar Valley understood that something was terribly wrong. The mountains that had always felt like protective guardians suddenly seemed vast and indifferent, holding secrets in their shadows that no amount of searching could immediately reveal. The next morning brought organized chaos to the usually quiet trailhead. Sheriff's deputies arrived before dawn, followed by volunteers from 3 counties who'd driven through the night to help. The Mountain Rescue Association deployed teams with tracking dogs, their excited barking echoing through valleys that had fallen unnaturally silent. Linda Mitchell sat in the passenger seat of their station wagon, clutching a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her face, normally animated by quick smiles and easy laughter, had taken on the hollow expression that families of missing persons learn to wear, hope battling against a growing dread that settles deeper with each passing hour. "She knows these trails better than most of the search teams," Robert kept repeating to anyone who would listen. He'd been a mining foreman before the local operations shut down, and his hands, scarred from years of physical labor, shook slightly as he unfolded and refolded topographical maps. Sarah's been hiking here since she could walk. The search effort revealed how thoroughly the Mitchell family had woven themselves into the fabric of Cedar Valley life. Margaret Henderson closed her general store to coordinate food for the volunteers. The Methodist Church became an impromptu command center, its fellowship hall filled with maps, radio equipment, and the constant murmur of worried conversations. Danny Mitchell, only 19 and usually confident beyond his years, found himself thrust into a role he'd never wanted. He spoke to reporters from Salt Lake City television stations, his voice cracking slightly as he described his sister's experience in the mountains and her plans for the future. She was saving money to move to the city, he told a young reporter, whose styled hair looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of pine trees and granite peaks. She wanted to be a photographer. As days turned into weeks, the search evolved from urgent rescue to methodical investigation. Teams combed through miles of forest, checking every abandoned mine shaft, every hidden canyon, every place where someone might seek shelter or where an accident might occur. The old mining tunnels presented particular challenges. Some descended hundreds of feet into the mountain, their wooden supports rotted and unstable. Walt Thompson, the rancher who'd seen Sarah that morning, became an unwilling focal point of speculation. In small towns, suspicion can spread like wildfire, and his brief encounter with Sarah took on significance that made him uncomfortable. Sheriff's deputies questioned him repeatedly, always politely but with increasing persistence. His wife Eleanor noticed how neighbors' conversations would stop when he entered Henderson's store, how glances lingered a moment too long. "I told her to be careful of the weather," Walt explained for the dozenth time to Deputy Harrison, a young man who'd grown up 2 counties over and didn't understand the intricate social dynamics of mountain communities. Clouds were building over the peaks. That's all we talked about. The seasonal shift made searching increasingly difficult. September gave way to October, and early snow began dusting the higher elevations. Morning frost turned search areas treacherous, and the shorter days meant fewer hours of effective visibility. Many of the volunteer searchers had jobs and families that demanded attention, and the intense community focus that had sustained the initial effort began to fragment. By November, when the first serious snowstorm blanketed the mountains, the active search had largely ended. Sarah's case moved to Sheriff Daniels' desk, joining a thin file of unsolved disappearances that stretched back decades. Hunters who'd never returned home, hikers who'd vanished into the wilderness, people who'd simply walked into the vast indifference of the mountains and never walked out. The Mitchell family's Christmas that year was a hollow ritual. Sarah's stocking hung on the mantel, her chair remained at the dinner table, and her room stayed exactly as she'd left it. Hiking boots by the door, photography magazines stacked on her dresser, a half-finished letter to a friend in California tucked under her jewelry box. Linda Mitchell aged visibly during those first months, her dark hair showing streaks of grey that hadn't been there in September. Robert threw himself into his work with desperate intensity, accepting overtime shifts and extra projects that kept him away from the house where every room held reminders of their missing daughter. The town of Cedar Valley learned to live with the unanswered question that Sarah's disappearance had become. Conversations would pause when someone mentioned hiking alone. Parents held their children a little closer. The mountains, once a source of pride and recreation, now carried an undercurrent of unease that would persist for decades, a reminder that even the most familiar places could harbor mysteries that defied explanation. Cedar Valley, Utah, August 12, 2019. The abandoned Copper King mine had been sealed for 37 years when exploration company geologist Dr. Rachel Torres first descended into its depths with her survey team. Modern mining techniques and environmental regulations had made many old sites viable again, and Torres specialized in assessing the safety and potential of forgotten excavations throughout the American West. Her headlamp cut through darkness that had remained undisturbed since the early 1980s, illuminating timber supports that had somehow maintained their structural integrity despite decades of mountain weather and underground moisture. The mine tunneled nearly 400 feet into the mountainside, following a copper vein that early miners had exhausted long before environmental concerns existed. "Air quality's better than expected," Torres called back to her assistant, Mark Chen, as they navigated around a collapsed section of tunnel about 200 feet from the entrance. Their voices echoed strangely in the confined space, and their breath formed small clouds in the consistently cool air. It was Chen who noticed the anomaly, a section of tunnel wall where the natural rock face had been disturbed, where loose stones had been carefully arranged to create what looked like a deliberate concealment. His geological training told him this wasn't natural formation or mining debris. Someone had intentionally altered this section of the tunnel. "Dr. Torres, you need to see this," he called, his voice carrying an odd tension that made her immediately abandon her examination of ore samples. Behind the carefully arranged stones, they discovered a small cavity that had been carved into the solid rock. Inside, Wrapped in what had once been a plastic garbage bag, lay a blue day pack, the kind popular with hikers in the early 1980s. The plastic had degraded over the decades, but the pack itself remained remarkably preserved in the cool, dry air of the underground chamber. Torres had spent enough time in the mountains to recognize the significance of what they'd found. She immediately contacted the Wasatch County Sheriff's Department, and within hours, the mine entrance was marked with yellow tape, while investigators documented the scene with the meticulous care of modern forensic science. Detective Maria Santos, who'd transferred to the rural county from Salt Lake City 3 years earlier, found herself holding evidence from a case that predated her law enforcement career. The pack contained items that painted a haunting picture of interrupted plans: a water bottle still half full after nearly 4 decades, a trail map with a route marked in red ink, energy bars whose packaging looked impossibly dated, and a small notebook filled with observations about wildlife and mountain weather. But it was the wallet, protected by the pack's inner pocket, that transformed the discovery from interesting artifact to breakthrough evidence. Sarah Mitchell's driver's license, issued in 1981, stared back at Detective Santos from a photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and an optimistic smile, the same photograph that had appeared on missing person flyers throughout the region in 1982. The pack's discovery sent ripples through Cedar Valley's aging population. Many residents remembered the intensive search efforts, the helicopters that had circled overhead for weeks, the gradual transition from hope to acceptance that had marked the community's relationship with Sarah's disappearance. Linda Mitchell, now 78 and living in a retirement community in Provo, received the phone call on a Tuesday morning while she was tending to the small garden outside her apartment. Her hands shook as Detective Santos explained the discovery, and she had to sit down on her wooden bench among the tomatoes she'd been watering. "After all these years," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent wondering and waiting. "We always hoped we'd find some answers." Robert had died 6 years earlier, never knowing what had happened to his daughter. Danny, now in his 50s and living in Denver with his own family, made immediate plans to return to Utah. The boy who'd helped coordinate search efforts in 1982 had become a successful engineer, but the unresolved questions about his sister had never truly left him. The location of the pack raised immediate questions that would reshape the entire understanding of Sarah's disappearance. The Copper King mine was more than 3 miles from the ridge trail where she'd planned to hike, across difficult terrain that would have required deliberate navigation to reach. More importantly, the mine had been sealed and posted with warning signs since 1979, 3 years before Sarah vanished. Someone had known about the mine's interior, had access to get inside despite the barriers, and had taken considerable effort to conceal the pack in a location where it might never have been discovered. The careful arrangement of stones, the deliberate carving of the hiding place, suggested planning and knowledge that contradicted every theory about Sarah's disappearance that had been developed over the previous 37 years. As Detective Santos stood at the mine entrance on that August morning, looking out over the valley where Sarah Mitchell had grown up, she understood that finding the pack was only the beginning. The mountains that had kept their secrets for nearly 4 decades were finally ready to tell a story that would challenge everything Cedar Valley thought it knew about that September day in 1982. The break came from an unexpected source: Margaret Henderson's personal effects, discovered in her garage after the 91-year-old store owner died peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks after Sarah's pack was found. Her nephew, cleaning out decades of accumulated belongings, discovered a shoebox hidden behind Christmas decorations that contained items that had no business being there. Inside the box, Detective Santos found Sarah's 35mm camera, the one her family had assumed she'd taken on her final hike. More disturbing were the developed photographs inside, images of the Copper King mine's interior, taken with the flash attachment that Sarah always carried for indoor photography. The timestamps on the photo paper indicated they'd been developed at Henderson's store in October 1982, a month after Sarah's disappearance. The photographs showed someone who clearly knew the mine's layout, documenting the exact chamber where the pack would later be discovered. But they also revealed something else: evidence of regular use, camping equipment, supplies, and makeshift furniture that suggested the sealed mine had been someone's secret refuge. Margaret Henderson had been a fixture in Cedar Valley for over 60 years, trusted with everyone's secrets and privy to every piece of community gossip. She'd coordinated the volunteer efforts during Sarah's search, had provided food and supplies for the rescue teams, and had never once mentioned that she possessed Sarah's camera or that she'd developed photographs of the mine where Sarah's belongings would eventually be found. The investigation that followed revealed a more complex story than anyone had imagined. Walt Thompson, now 84 and suffering from advancing dementia, began experiencing moments of confusion where past and present blurred together. His wife, Eleanor, exhausted from years of caregiving, finally shared concerns she'd harbored for decades. He used to disappear sometimes, she told Detective Santos during a quiet conversation in their farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd prepared meals for search volunteers in 1982. Especially after they closed the mines, he'd say he was checking on equipment or livestock, but he'd be gone for hours, sometimes all day. Eleanor's memories, preserved with the clarity that comes from years of worry, painted a picture of a man struggling with the economic changes that had devastated the mining community. Walt had lost his job when Copper King shut down, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic as financial pressures mounted. The final piece of the puzzle emerged from Margaret Henderson's personal journals, also discovered in her garage. Her entries from late 1982 revealed a community secret that had been carefully maintained for nearly 4 decades. Margaret had written about Walt's breakdown following an encounter with Sarah on the trail, not the brief conversation he'd described to investigators, but something far more serious. According to her notes, Walt had confided in her that he'd followed Sarah, worried about her safety as storm clouds gathered, but his protective instincts had turned into something darker when she'd rejected his offers of help and his suggestion that she turn back. The journals described how Walt had accidentally caused Sarah to fall during an argument near a creek crossing, how he'd panicked when he realized she was seriously injured, and how he'd carried her to the mine where he'd been secretly living since losing his job and home. Sarah had died from her injuries despite his attempts to help her, and Walt, terrified of the consequences, had concealed her body deeper in the mine before eventually moving it to a location that remained unknown. Margaret had discovered Walt's secret when he'd brought Sarah's camera to the store, claiming he'd found it on a trail. The developed photographs had revealed the truth, and Margaret had made a decision that would haunt Cedar Valley for decades. She'd chosen to protect Walt rather than seek justice for Sarah. Her journals revealed the reasoning of a woman who'd watched her community struggle through economic hardship and social upheaval. Walt had a wife and young children. His family would be destroyed by scandal and imprisonment. Sarah was already gone, and nothing could bring her back. In Margaret's mind, preserving one family seemed more important than pursuing justice that would only create more victims. The revelation shattered Cedar Valley's understanding of itself. For 37 years, the community had believed they'd lost Sarah to the indifferent dangers of the wilderness. The discovery that she'd died because of human actions and that her death had been concealed by people they'd trusted forced residents to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, justice, and the price of protecting secrets. Walt Thompson died in a care facility 2 months after the investigation concluded, his dementia having progressed to the point where he could no longer provide coherent answers about Sarah's death. Eleanor chose to remain in Cedar Valley, accepting the complicated sympathy of neighbors who struggled to balance decades of friendship with the weight of revealed truth. Linda Mitchell attended Margaret Henderson's funeral, sitting quietly in the back of the Methodist church where search efforts had been coordinated so many years earlier. She'd chosen forgiveness over anger, understanding that Margaret had acted from misguided compassion rather than malice. But the knowledge that Sarah's death could have been prevented if the truth had been told in 1982 was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Sarah's remains were never found, despite extensive searches of the area around the Copper King mine. Detective Santos suspected they'd been moved to one of dozens of abandoned shafts that honeycomb the mountains around Cedar Valley, hidden in depths that might never yield their secrets. But Sarah Mitchell's story had finally been told, and Cedar Valley learned to live with a truth more complicated than the mysteries they'd carried for nearly 4 decades. In the end, it wasn't the mountains that had taken their daughter, sister, and friend. It was the all-too-human capacity for fear, desperation, and the terrible choices people make when they believe they have no other options. The case was officially closed on a cold February morning in 2020, filed away with the notation that while the circumstances of Sarah Mitchell's death had been determined, her final resting place remained unknown, one last secret that the mountains of Utah continued to keep.